Gaddafi's regime, him and his family. This is the slogan now in the streets by elderly, young people, doctors, lawyers, judges. Here next to the court, there are thousands now sleeping in the streets.
And we'll bring you another eyewitness account from Benghazi. One man told us what he's been seeing in the city's hospital.
The situation in Benghazi is very bad. The death toll is more than 70. With my very eyes, I saw more than 70 bodies in hospital, and people are allowed to go into the place where the bodies are kept in order to identify them. And the people who were demonstrating, when they tried to stage a sit-in outside the security unit, the security shot at them. There were many injuries. Many people were still on the ground suffering from their injuries, and the security personnel prevented the ambulances from getting to them. There is loss of security in some areas because of the prisoners that were let out.
Well, let's give you a quick reminder about the man that the protesters are demanding steps down in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was born to nomadic parents in 1942. He left school early to join the army, and then in 1969 he led a group of junior officers in a bloodless coup that ended King Idris's 18-year rule. By 1971, Gaddafi had turned his back on the West, supporting groups that the West considered to be terrorists, such as the Irish Republican Army and the Palestine Liberation Organization. The United States carried out airstrikes on the cities of Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986, killing Gaddafi's adopted baby daughter. And sanctions were imposed on the country in the 1990s. In 2003, Gaddafi beat a path back to international favor. He accepted responsibility for the bombing of an airliner over the Scottish town of Lockerbie and halting the development of weapons of mass destruction. Today, he is the longest-serving leader in both Africa and the Arab world. Now in Bahrain, security forces have opened fire on anti-government protesters gathered in the capital, Manama, for a second time on Friday. Hundreds of mourners were marching towards the Pearl roundabout when government forces fired live rounds and tear gas. The wounded were taken to the city's main Salmaniya hospital, where protesters have gathered to offer blood and support. This report from our correspondent in Manama. For security reasons and his own safety, we're not naming him.
The emergency room of Bahrain's largest hospital straining to cope as the first patients are treated. Doctors battle to save the most seriously ill. This man has a bullet lodged in his brain.
There was a rush of people, injured, casualties. There are hundreds of patients who were brought in the hospital. There are still people who are lying in the roundabout. There are still people who are thrown in the street. We don't know how many patients are there so far. And they've stopped the ambulances from going there again, once again.
For one doctor, the stress was too much. Some patients have clearly been traumatized by what's happened to them. Relatives are angry. This woman says she hopes God will bring down the Khalifa family. The hospital beds are full. These were unarmed protesters who'd been marching peacefully when the military started firing live rounds and tear gas at them.
They fired at us from all sides, using guns, rubber bullets and live ammunition. It came from everywhere, from the air, from the riot police and the Air Force. They used tear gas, really all kinds of weapons.
Outside the Salmaniya hospital, crowds began to grow. This had become a place of protest. Down, down, Hamid, a reference to this country's ruler, King Hamid. Hours after the troops opened fire, the injured were still being brought here, to the shock of the crowd. Some of the protesters are already vowing to march again in the coming days. They say the heavy-handed tactics of the authorities will not stop them. AlJazeera, Bahrain.
Now, the King of Bahrain says he has asked the Crown Prince to begin what he's called national dialogue with the protesters. Earlier, the Prince appeared on state television calling for calm.
للرجل اللي بيطلق رصاصة I say calm down to the person who throws stones and to the person who shoots bullets. This doesn't serve anybody.
Do you want to withdraw the security forces from the street?
We are talking, the security forces, we are talking about controlling the situation. We cannot really do impulsive decision at this moment.
Well, the current unrest isn't just confined to Libya and Bahrain. To give you a sense of the protests that are sweeping the whole region, take a look at this map. We've highlighted all the countries where there have been public protests of one kind or another, either in support of their governments or against, or in some cases both. In Yemen, at least 6 people have been killed during anti-government protests in the past 24 hours. A so-called Friday of Rage attracted thousands of people to the capital, Sana'a. Demonstrations calling for the president to resign have now gone on for 8 consecutive days. In Jordan, at least 8 people were injured in clashes between pro- and anti-government groups. The fighting broke out in the capital, Amman, after Friday prayers, protesters calling for more freedoms and lower food prices. It was the 7th day in a row in which Jordanians have rallied. And Friday's also marked 1 week since the mass protests in Egypt succeeded in toppling Hosni Mubarak from power. Millions of Egyptians filled the streets to mark the occasion and to maintain the pressure on the new military government, which has promised democratic reform. Rawia Rageh reports from Cairo's Liberation Square.
Draped in red, white and black, thousands of Egyptians come to Tahrir Square, this time not in protest, rather to mark their hard-won victory.
Contrary to the scenes of anger and frustration that lasted here in Tahrir Square for days before Hosni Mubarak stepped down, the mood this Friday is one of joy and celebrations, smiles everywhere.
And a tribute to the country's military, who even before the end of Mubarak's rule last week was hailed for not obstructing the pro-democracy movement. The military had asked Egyptians to stop their protests, but it did not prevent the gathering on Friday. Instead, Tahrir was surrounded by tanks and soldiers who searched people and regulated traffic. The gathering not only a victory march, but also a memorial to the 300+ people who lost their lives in the uprising. The highlight of the day, an appearance by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of Sunni Islam's most prominent clerics. In a heartfelt ceremony, he praised the revolution, the youth behind it, and the military, though he did make a direct request.
I call on the Egyptian army to liberate us from the government that Mubarak formed in his last days. We want a new government that does not include the old faces that remind people of poverty and misery.
But he also urged patience with the country's interim military leadership. The current cabinet was appointed by Mubarak before he stepped down. A reshuffle is expected in the coming few days.
I came here all the way from Upper Egypt because all I want is an end to corruption. We want this government changed. We don't want Mubarak's party members in power.
It is true that we need to be patient, but at the same time we need to remind